Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to Soul Talk. This is Leora Mandel. I'll be joined with Rabbi David Aaron after the break. To what extent do we make choices in our life? Do we choose what happens in our life? And to what extent is our life determined for us? This is the very big question of free will versus determinism. And it is a big question, and one that I think we really should think about once in a while in our personal lives to understand, where do I really have free choice? Where is my life? How is my life where it is today because of choices that I've made? Where am I responsible for where my life is because of the choices I have made? And what aspects of my life, if I believe that there's a God in the world, if I believe that God is involved in my life, in the world, He's involved in setting up situations for me to grow through. Hopefully that's what it is, to grow through. But at the same time, I also have free will to make choices. So what in my life is because of choices I have made? And what in my life is because this is part of what I was meant to go through, grow through, and it might seem as though I made certain choices to bring it about, but at the same time, it was part of the divine plan that I should have this experience, and it really wasn't a choice that I made. And how do we understand where the two meet? Sometimes it almost seems like there can be a bit of a contradiction of how can I have free will if there's a certain amount of determination and knowing when do I have free will. And I think there is a practical point in understanding and thinking this through. But there also is this question on a global level, not just in my individual life, but in the world, the way the world works, the way nations work. If we look throughout history, there's certain patterns that keep repeating themselves. Were these patterns created by God as part of the global plan for what happens in the world? Or were these patterns created because people make poor decisions or good decisions? If a nation is successful, is that because of its own choices? Or is it because that was God's plan to make this specific nation successful at this specific time in the world? And if a nation is at war, if a nation is suffering, is that because of choices that leadership made, the people themselves made choices in how they're living their lives that they merited to have the success? Or is this part of some good divine plan that maybe we don't fully understand? But in a group level, a global level, in groups, when it's not just one person making a decision, how does this question of free will versus determinism work? And then how does that interplay in my individual life, especially if we're talking about on a global level of, I live in a country and this is the situation that's going on there. There's a situation going on in the world right now, the way it affects me. How does that work on a global level and when that peters down into an individual level? I want to understand this concept more. I think, again, it's an interesting philosophical question, but more important than that, it really does have practical significance for our lives. So when we return Soul Talk, Rabbi David Aaron and Leora Mandel, getting more clarity on understanding free will versus determinism.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
And welcome to Soul Talk. This is Leora Mandel with Rabbi David Aaron. Rabbi Aaron, I've been recently watching some history documentaries and listening to different history podcasts. And what is so fascinating is I think we get so used to the times that we live in now that we have to sometimes just taking a step back, pulling the lens back and seeing these patterns that repeat themselves throughout time, or realizing that things that might have happened hundreds of years ago as nations, as groups, we're still struggling with today, some making similar kinds of decisions, mistakes, struggling with some of the same issues. And it really got me thinking, in terms of, I just think on the one hand, I understand that God has a plan for the world. On the other hand, there's all these decisions that are made by countries, by groups. There's history that we can read about all the wars that we've gotten ourselves into, the disputes, the fights. We can't figure out a way how we can all possibly get along, how what one nation decides affects another nation. This goes on. And I was wondering, how does that work? Meaning, it's almost in a way harder for me to understand how we have a lot of people as opposed to one person when when it comes to free will, making decisions. How does that work in terms of understanding God's plan for the world? Are nations, are groups making their own decisions that come out, have a sense of how things pan out within the whole spectrum of God's plan for the world? Or somehow, do we have free will when it comes to that, or are we all playing into God's plan somehow or another?
Right, that is the question of questions. And we have to begin by recognizing that what the prophet said, that in the name of Hashem, my thoughts are not your thoughts. And that's from Yeshayahu, Isaiah, chapter 55, verse 8. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. In other words, we first need to realize that we can't fit God's thinking into the logical pattern of our thinking. And that essentially the question that you're asking, which is the classic question of predeterminism versus free choice, the answer is basically yes, meaning it's beyond the either or. And that's something that our minds can't wrap around. It's either this or it's that. How can they be both? And yet our sages tell us that they are both. In fact, it's really summed up in our oral tradition in a book called Pirkei Avot, the Chapters of Our Fathers, that says Hakol Tzafui, all is foreseen, V'harashut Netuna, and yet permission has been granted. And that's it. Permission has been granted for you to be making choices. And we could try and make that feel a little more relatable by using this metaphor. The metaphor I use is, imagine a painting. And on that painting, there's an ant. And where the ant is at would be the ant's present. Where the ant was before was its past. And where the ant is going will be its future. Now we are looking at the painting, and what appears to the ant as the past, the present, and the future, for us is all absolutely now. So Hakol Tzafui, we see it all. But Shut Netuna, but the ant has the permission to make choices. And what are those choices? How that ant, so to speak, strings together in his own subjective viewing that painting. He could choose to go right, or he could choose to go left. No matter what he chooses, it's all being painted right there. But the little segments of life that he sees are his choices, and he strings together. So you might say that if we use the words objective and subjective, God's perspective would be the objective. Objective history is all being written, but our subjective reading of that history, our perception of that history, is really very free. How we're going to perceive it and the choices that we're going to make is how we're going to receive it. And so each little segment of that ant is a day, and he could have turned this way or he could have turned that way. And as he decides the sequence of events, his history will look very, very different.
See, on an individual level, I feel like what you're saying gives clarity, and yet it's still, you have to struggle in your own mind to sort of wrap yourself around the yes and yes. That's a little bit almost of a paradox, that we have the free will, and at the same time there is some plan and predetermination within that, and yet we still have choice within that. And I sort of get that, but it gets more complicated the more people you add in, because when you're talking about a group, or you're talking about, let's say I happen to live in a country that's at war, then the decisions that are made that then lead to, sometimes you look back in history, why did this war start? How did it happen? How are these two groups fighting, and all the chaos that ensues? And when I'm one person in that cog, was that war, was it really started by decisions that were made by free choice, or is it something that was meant to happen and I just got stuck in it?
Well, so it's important that we understand that free choice does not mean unlimited choice. See, very often people think free choice means I can free to do just absolutely anything I want to do. No, you are free, but you are free within a certain limitations of what's available to you. Going back to our metaphor, I can't come up with a different picture. The picture is the picture. Now, how I'm going to view the picture, and that's how the sequence of the events will appear to me, and it'll look completely different. But the picture is a done deal. I can't create a new picture, but I can determine the sequence of how I'm going to string together the choices of my viewing of the picture. And so, yeah, and as I said, I'm not suggesting that I'm making any sense here, because this starts off in Yeshayahu and Isaiah. God is saying, my thoughts are not your thoughts. And so God doesn't have to play by the rules of logic. And the rules of logic, either things are determined or things are free. From God's point of view, he says, no, I don't know why you think that way. It's possible for a third option, which includes those two opposites. That's really what quantum physics is more and more revealing to us today, that, classical logic said 1 + 1 or 1 + 2 is 1 + 1 or 1 + 2. But is it possible there's a 1 + 1 or 2, and there's a 1 or 2? And that is something that today's science is beginning to accept, that reality is operating according to a different pattern of thought than our own thought. And when we try to stuff reality and try to make sense of it based on the way we think, that's kind of like trying to put, if anybody still remembers, a cassette into a CD player. It's just like you don't have the equipment to really make sense out of it. Well, then, if that's true, then what's the point of even having this conversation if the bottom line is we don't understand? Well, we don't understand, but there is an attitude that is a very important attitude that we need to, that we can and we need to draw from this paradox. And that is, when it comes to the future, then our attitude should be, it's all an open field. And I have to take responsibility and make a choice. I can't say, well, since it's already been written, since the painting is already being painted. No. From my perspective, I don't know what the future is, and therefore I have to make a choice. But once I make that choice and the results are in, then the way I should look back at my life is to say, okay, then it was God's plan. And that's an amazing optimist attitude, that when it comes to the future, it's an open field. But when I make a choice and the results are in and I can't change that choice, what happened, then I look back and I say, okay, well, that was God's plan. And somehow that's all going to be good and can be recycled or can be used for good. And then I say, but now looking towards the future, and I say, well, if I make a choice, then the results are in. So then that means I don't have a choice. No. And this is the attitude we have to live with. In terms of the future, it's all free. In terms of our past, it was all determined. And therefore, we will make a free choice. The results will come in. And then we have to look at it and not live our lives saying, everything could have been different. If only I would have made a different choice, everything could have been different. Because that drives you crazy. But rather say, okay, I made that choice. The results are in. I can't change the results. Okay, well, so now I make a new choice.
That really explains the question I think many of us will struggle with in any given situation where you say, should I just accept what's going on? Is that my job here, is to say, okay, God, I have to go through this situation or this challenge and I just need to accept it? Or do I actively try to make a change? And what you're giving clarity here on that really big question is it depends on, what stage of the game we're at. If something already happened, then you have to accept this is what happened. But then looking forward, the question is if I want to change the situation, that is still in my hands. And so it's interesting because what you're saying is just like there's both. We're always balancing both of, on the one hand, that we make choices and that determines our future, but at the same time, there is determination that God has, and how can it be both at the same time? We're also always balancing accepting and actively making change by looking forward, accepting what was in the past and actively making change as we look forward to what the next step is that we're going to make. When we return, Soul Talk, Rabbi David Aaron and Leora Mandel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Hello and welcome back to Soul Talk, talking with Rabbi David Aaron, trying to get an understanding in the complex topic of free will and that we have free will and free choice. At the same time, God has his plan for us and for the world, and so there's a certain amount of predetermination, and how can we have both at once? And what's the role that we're taking? And when we live our lives, do we just say, well, okay, this is predetermined, just accept? Or do I say, no, I have free will, I have free choice. The choices I make now will actually have impact on my life. And Rabbi, right before the break, you gave a very powerful formula of looking forward. Looking back, I apologize, you have to accept that what happened, happened. But looking forward, you have to recognize my free choice and my choices that I make will tangibly have an effect on what will happen. But once it happens, that was part of the divine plan.
Right. Now, let me add another practical implication of this philosophy. See, a person can easily say, well, if God knows what I'm going to do, then it really doesn't make a difference what choice I make. Well, there's a tremendous flaw in that thinking, because if God knows what you're going to do or not has absolutely no relevance to you, because you don't know what you're going to do or not, and so you still have to make a choice. And so when a person says, well, if the script has been written, the story has been written, the painting has been painting, then it really doesn't make any difference what choice I make, and therefore I could choose to jump out the window, or I could choose to not jump out the window. Well, you know what? It really doesn't matter what God thinks. You don't know what God's thinking, and therefore you have to make a choice. And that's why this people have to separate philosophy from the daily responsibility of how we function. And so that's why this whole determinism thing, when people use it as an argument against their free choice and say, well, it doesn't really matter what I choose, what will be, and it is what it is, and it will be what it is, and that's what it is, and that's all it is. That's a very negative thing, and it's completely impractical. And so that's what's so beautiful. You kind of get the best of both worlds. You have free choice, and therefore looking ahead, it's an open field. Yes, the script has been written. Looking back, it was perfectly designed, and if it happened, then it was God's plan. But now you don't know what God's plan is for the next seconds, and so now you have to make a choice.
So when you're talking about, is it philosophical or practically real in our lives? So on an individual level, I definitely see it's very important to understand this on a practical level, because my philosophy about this matter will affect the practical decisions I make in my life, or lack of making decisions, if I understand to what degree my decisions matter or not. But on a generalized level, on the group level, on a country worldwide level, is it more philosophical for understanding, let's say a country enters war? Was that poor decisions that a country made that led to its state of, let's say, war or economic deprivation, etc.? Or is it that this is part of God's plan, that regardless of the decisions that people made, we can always explain it? There's always, even today, there's economists that will explain, let's say, why the economy is it's gone down or why it's gone up, why one country is successful and another is not. Is that from decisions that are made, or is on the larger level, when it comes to not just me as an individual, do the same rules apply?
Now, this is God's will. Now, again, that doesn't mean that, oh, well, if it's God's will, then, if there's terrible racism in the world, well, there's nothing I can do about it. No, there's something you can do about it. What choice are you going to make in order to make a difference? But if it's happening, it's happening. And that's the interesting practical takeaway from here. It's like, could this have all have been different? And looking back, no. When we look back, it could not have all been different. Can it now become different? Yes, it can all become different. So could have, when we look into the past, we have to accept with perfect trust that there's a plan and somehow there's an opportunity here for growth. Looking towards the future, what choice do you have to make? But to simply say that we are pawns in some game, and what's happening right now, like world forces are happening, and so what can I do? You can just do what you can do. I mean, the Prime Minister of Israel has never called me and asked me my opinion on anything, and the President of the United States has never called me or asked me about anything either. So this is not within the realm of the choices I can make or the sphere of influence I have, because they're not calling me and I can't reach them. But in my own life, what are the choices that what is happening on a global scale are the choices that I can make, and what differences can I participate in making happen?
So it really, I guess I keep thinking back on the general sense of things, but it is more practical to go back to, I can't change the world. I really need to focus on where it's the change that I can make. And that really starts with me, myself, and the way whatever's going on in the world affects my personal life, as opposed to thinking about the general world. How far does this go into the details of our life in terms of, I think we all, even in our own lives, we see there's more significant events in our lives. And I think even those we'd say, again, some of it was created both by the choices we make, and that at the same time recognize this was part of God's divine plan. But when it comes to certain of the smaller details of our life, is there a concept that God is also, there's some determinism even within that, like exactly certain details of how my days come out today, or just the larger picture of my life?
Right. Well, so this is a very famous dispute between the Rambam Maimonides and the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Rambam, there are two kinds of providence. There's what's called hashgacha pratit, individualized providence, and hashgacha klalit, general providence. And the Rambam says that there's a general providence, which is, birds fly and fish swim, and when it comes to the general workings of the world, it's on kind of automatic pilot. When it comes to your life, you need to merit individual providence. It could be that you'll just be part of a general automatic pilot that just keeps the world in a homeostasis kind of way, or through your deeds and the choices that you make, you will be able to tune into and receive personal guidance and various degrees of that. And so therefore, from the Rambam's point of view, a person cannot say, well, all this came directly from God and it was addressed to me. I'm part of a general, plan of providence, and I didn't do anything to deserve any level of particular individualized providence. That's the Rambam. The Baal Shem Tov, based on the Kabbalistic teachings, he had a completely different approach. He said, no, everything is individualized providence. And even the moment a leaf was released from a tree, and even the route it takes as it starts to swirl down towards the ground, and even exactly where it lands, has been perfectly designed by God, and absolutely everything is of perfect divine design and direct providence. Now, there are some who say, and this is my attitude, that really the Rambam and the Baal Shem Tov were referring to two aspects of life, and they were not disagreeing. And that the Rambam was describing things as they appear subjectively, and the Baal Shem Tov was describing things as they actually are objectively. Objectively, everything is completely down to the tiniest detail, absolutely guided by the Creator. And that's objectively. Subjectively, how much of that will you receive in your life? It's like a radio. There's music playing objectively, but subjectively, our radio is not turned on, tuned in to that music, and therefore we're just hearing noise. And so some explain that the Rambam was making a comment in terms of how things subjectively are manifest, and if you align yourself more and more with God's will, you will see God's individual providence more and more. If you don't, then you will feel that you're part of just some general story, and none of this is, or not much of this is really directed specifically towards you. And the Baal Shem Tov was saying, well, objectively, it's all absolutely perfectly designed, every single detail, whether in nature or whether this very moment in your life. And the question is, will that become something that you experience in your subjective world?
That really goes in line with what you were saying earlier, where it's a simultaneous. We're making decisions that affect our lives, and there's larger divine providence that's going on in our lives, and it sort of is up to us what the perspective is that we're coming in. And so I think what's so powerful about merging these two perspectives of Rambam and the Baal Shem Tov is that it helps us realize that how much do we determine our lives and how much is our lives determined. To some degree, that's also up to us, because if I'm going to be more conscious of God in my life and the effects of God in my life and the power of God to affect my life, then there will be more of that power of God to affect my life. And if I'm going to be wanting to just live without that consciousness, if I'm going to just not really think much about God, not think about the fact that there's a God that's involved in my life, that affecting what goes on in my life, then there is a certain course of nature, so to speak, that God has set up in the world. And there's certain laws of that sense of nature, and that's what will determine my life more. So it really, the choice I make to understand and realize and see God's providence in my life very much affects how much of it I will ultimately see in my life. When we return to Soul Talk, Rabbi David Aaron and Leora Mandel.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome back to Soul Talk. Leora Mandel with Rabbi David Aaron. Rabbi Aaron, the idea that you were sharing before the break about there's these two aspects of hashgacha pratit, hashgacha klalit, God's divine providence on our lives, and to what extent it's going to be detailed in our lives versus just overall in the general sense that God has a certain plan and flow of the world. We're going to go with it. It doesn't mean that every detail of our life God is involved in. I think is very life-changing because, again, it really empowers us that if we recognize, I once heard this idea is where is God wherever you let him in? And that really is here, meaning God is everywhere. But if I'm not consciously aware that God is having an effect on my life, then I'm going to have less of a feeling and a sense of God in the details of my life. And there's also, it's reflected in a certain reality, because it sounds like what you're saying is there's both going on, that God is involved in the world in all the details, but at the same time, he did create a system that can appear as though he's not as involved. There's just a certain flow that will happen. Where do I want to find myself? So it depends on me.
Right. Although I do want to make it clear, it's not that they're both happening. There's a third option that our minds cannot wrap around that appears to us as both. I mean, even when we say God has a plan, there's something theologically wrong with even saying that, because that's a statement in time. A plan means I'm now and I'm thinking in terms of the future. But that all has any meaning because of beings who think in terms of time. But God created time, and he is not subject to the limitations of time. And therefore, even talking about God having a plan is is actually nonsensical from his point of view, because that would imply that God is in a time frame looking towards a time frame that he doesn't have yet. And from God's point of view, the past, the present, and future are all happening now, and God is in the eternal now. And all this is just the way it appears to us. And the only reason we're having this conversation is not because we're trying to understand God, because we never will. We only have these conversations if it helps us understand who we are and what are the parameters of our choices and how to cope with things that are happening in our lives in the most optimal way. And so we always talk about God only in so much as whatever we say is relevant to our lives, always reminding us that whatever we're saying is all relative to our way of thinking and is in no way capturing the truth from God's perspective.
Well, that is important to understand, but I guess that reminds us then why, to some degree, it is very hard for us to wrap our minds around how, again, is this divine plan, but at the same time we have free choice. But to some extent it might be, again, like we can only relate to the senses that we can experience now, the sense of sight, the sense of smell. You can't hear a sight. You can't hear an apple, for example. You can't hear a flower. You can see a flower, you can smell a flower, but we don't hear a flower. And maybe there's some extent of the limitation in our ability to understand, again, because we live in time. And on the one hand, there are choices we understand we can make, but we also understand that there's limited. When we understand the concept of free will, again, there's contradictions. It's just because of our limitations. And as you're saying, God isn't limited. So when we are not limited anymore, we won't be feeling the sense of contradiction within what we're talking about here.
Right. There's a story. I heard this in the name of Mark Twain. He said, sometimes you didn't make a bad choice. You just had poor imagination. Because there was a third choice that you'd even think about. So we think that the choice is between free choice and determinism, and is it this or is it that? And the answer is there's a third choice that our brains have no access to that includes the best of both those positions.
So that in and of itself, in a sense, is, I think, the best option. But the thing is, I think having it all as a picture that you're painting for us is so important, because the first explanation of that, it sort of depends on us. If we in our lives recognize God is in the details, the more we recognize that, the more we'll see it, the more it will be a reality. We can strengthen that. Then that's a very important thing, because there's something we can do about that. We can use our free choice to have more free choice. We can use our free choice to have more divine providence in our lives. At the same time, for the pieces where our brain all of a sudden hit a wall, but I still can't understand how this idea works, then the third option is very important to explain how, that the third choice is understanding that we're limited in our ability to understand how this all works. And that's also
I'll give you a perfect example. What's going on right now with Corona? What if, I'm not suggesting this is the way, but there has been, suggestions that this is all coming from some lab in China. and that it was either intentional or that there was an accident, and the entire world has gone into a pandemic because somebody made a stupid mistake or somebody maliciously made a horrible choice. And all of us are suffering because of that. So if you think that way, you go crazy. Like, my gosh, it could have all been different. Well, according to what we're saying, no, it could not have all been different, because if this is what's happening, then somehow this is meant to be. So we shouldn't hold this guy responsible? No, if we can determine that somebody did this maliciously or accidentally, yes, they are responsible. But in terms of us going on with our lives and thinking, oh my gosh, look how life is just so fickle in it, and everything could have been different. No, everything could not have been different. So then I'll do nothing about it. No, everything towards the future could be different, but your attitude towards the past is to accept it and believe that there is some opportunity of blessing waiting to be unleashed from it.
I have to say, this is probably the healthiest way one could ever live their lives, and it would save so much anxiety and so much depression, because I think there's so often, specifically more in our personal lives, that we'll look at a situation and we'll beat ourselves up over, what if I had done this different? What if I made different choices with the way I raised my children? What if I made different choices in the way in my marriage? What if I made different choices in how I educate? I mean, we can go on and on and on of how my life might have been different if I made different choices, and it's unhealthy. It's not helpful at this point. It's water under the bridge. But the mindset that you're sharing here on the global and personal level of recognizing what was, and part of what was meant to be. Where my energy, where I should focus is moving forward. I still have choices to make, and that will affect my future. So focus my energies there.
Exactly. It is incredibly healthy. I mean, I once shared, but I don't know how long ago, how my family was in a terrible, terrible car accident. It was a fellow who was negligent. He fell asleep at the wheel. He was not in a car, he was in a van, and it was raining, and he lost control of the car because he fell asleep, and his van flipped over and started coming at my brother-in-law's car. I wasn't in the car. I was in America. My whole family was in the car, and it was a devastating accident with injuries till today. The man himself, who was responsible, miraculously walked out of his car that had rolled over and off the road without a scratch, whereby my family, each and every one of them, had some different kind of injury. And what do you do with that? You just say, because this guy fell asleep, people are suffering, lifelong injuries? No, because he could have easily hit somebody else's car. His car could have gone off and there might have been no car. I mean, so am I angry at this man? Zero. I have zero anger towards this man. He has to take responsibility for the mistake he made, for the negligence in driving a car when he is, when he was tired. But am I living with this anger that everything could have been different had this guy just been responsible? No, this is, in my mind, this is from God. And then how does this guy go on in his life? Should he be forever feeling horrible, that it's his fault that somebody has a lifetime injury? I hope not. He made a choice. It's a bad choice. And he needs to do tshuva. He needs to repent. He has to say to himself, I regret what I did. I recognize how bad it was, and I accept upon myself never to do that again. And whatever damages he's obligated to pay, he pays, and he gets on with his life. And I hope he doesn't live with this feeling that he can't sleep at night because he could have easily not hit anybody. So I just think people are suffering because they're trying to figure out too much. And so Judaism has a really optimal plan of how to live your life. When it comes to the past, accept it, see and try and find what opportunity you could glean from it. And in terms of the future, make bold choices.
What you're sharing really brings to light the story in the Torah about Yosef and his brothers, that when his brothers realized that he was the brother that they sold into slavery, and now he's prince and king, second to the king in Egypt. They were afraid for their lives, and yet what was his response? He said, you had your plans. God has his plans. I recognize that God was here all along. You just played into God's plans. There's no reason for me to be angry at you. And it really is such a powerful, what you're sharing is a similar idea in your personal life of when you can understand a person would be very angry, but you're talking about not just having a philosophy, but living a philosophy to the extent that when you go through something major in life, that you can really, again, have a certain sense of peace of mind of knowing how to think, how to feel, understanding that God was in this picture, how to not let go of anger. That oftentimes, in addition to the physical injury, something like that could hold on a person back for so many years, and to how to continue to live forward with a sense of empowerment.
Right. Well, and the important thing is, though, it's not like Joseph was saying to his brothers, you don't have to repent. No, you have to repent on the choices you make, but don't think that you had, power over how the events played out, because that's already in God's hands. It could have been, they could have easily been sold to somebody else, and somebody else could have, come by. There's just so many things that are just not in our control. So what is in our control? The choices that we make.
And that is very empowering to recognize, because the choices that we make, there's so many choices we can make at any given day and any given time. And the point is to live life forward and focus on what choices do I have to live the life I'd like to have from here on. I want to thank you all for joining us. Soul Talk, Rabbi David Aaron and Leora Mandel.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.